Welcome back. A recent report from TD Bank laid bare one of the big culprits in Canada's productivity problem, the construction sector. Here's a look by the numbers. We know productivity is a problem in Canada. We're now 30% less productive than the U.S., a gap that's worth $20,000 per person per year. That, in turn, suppresses wages here, which are estimated to be 8% below our U.S. peers, and it makes investments in Canada poor. $1,000 invested in Canadian stocks in 2000 would be worth $4,400 today. That same $1,000 invested in the U.S. market would be worth $6,000, a difference of 35%. One big culprit in Canada is the construction sector, which has seen declining productivity for decades, even as it grows in importance. More than 12% of all hours worked in Canada are now in this sector. Part of the reason for lagging productivity is that construction is dominated by small firms. 25% of businesses in the sector have fewer than 20 employees, and smaller firms tend to have lower productivity as they're slower to adopt new technology. There's also some evidence that regulatory burden plays a role in weak productivity in construction, including rules that differ from one place to the next. Of course, the biggest problem with construction's weak productivity is that it'll only make the whole Canadian problem worse as construction continues to grow as a share of our economy. James Marple is a senior economist at TD. Thanks for being with us, James.
You're welcome.
And that, of course, is part of the issue when we talk about Canadian productivity on a big picture level and we compare ourselves to other economies, as we must. Our economy is made up of some things that do hold us back. Construction is one that you have highlighted is a key area. Our oil and gas sector can be hit or miss depending on what you're measuring. Are there things that we do that just make it hard to be more productive at?
Well, there probably are a range of things that make it harder. I mean, we're a large country with a dispersed population, makes it harder to move things around. That's kind of been a disadvantage we've always had. But we also impose a lot of barriers on trade within the country, across jurisdictions. It's difficult to grow a business in one province and into another province just because of differences in regulations, in work codes, in permitting. Labor mobility is impaired by an inability to often be a professional in a different province. There are different regulations. So we do some things like that make it difficult for us. But I think those are the main things. And then we have these structural challenges by industry in terms of a growing construction sector, which is relatively low productivity, and moving just away from oil and gas, which is a very high productivity sector.
I have to say, we've been talking about Canada's productivity problem for decades. You have done a really good job over time of helping to describe it and even offering up some solutions. Those interprovincial trade barriers are one that you're referring to that can be a real friction and literally cost us dollars. And yet we don't see progress. So how frustrating is it for an economist to keep saying, here's the problem, and even here's how you might solve it, and yet we don't seem to do it?
Yeah, well, these are practical considerations. You get down to the local level, and a lot of these things make sense. But when you add them all up, it starts to really hurt. And it is easier, I think, easier to identify the problem. It's more difficult to then come up with a solution, and even more difficult to implement that, given just very different interests at different levels of government and even across society.
People hear this. We know it goes to our quality of life, right? When productivity is falling, your quality of life is also declining over time. But can we actually drill it down and say we need to work harder or smarter? We need to use more technology. How would you describe it to somebody who says, look, I work hard enough. What do you mean my productivity is not good?
Well, I think it really is a matter of having the best technologies and taking advantage of technological innovations as they happen even in other countries, and adopting them. And I think what has held back Canadian productivity way even prior to the pandemic wasn't that Canadians don't work hard, or certainly don't work long enough. In fact, we're working more and getting less because we're not being as innovative and as technologically advanced as we could. So the premise is, if you want wages to go up in a real way above inflation, and you want better public services, and you want to pay less taxes, then we need to be more efficient, and we need to be as productive as possible. It doesn't mean working harder. It does mean working smarter.
James, so good to have you for this. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
James Marple is a senior economist at TD. When it comes to efficiency in construction, one solution is factory-built homes, but we've been seeing slow progress to getting there. Kevin Lee is CEO of the Canadian Home Builders Association. Kevin, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And you looked deep into this issue. You're, in fact, part of a federal task force looking at how to build more houses in this country. Why don't we move better and faster towards standardizing processes like building in factories?
Well, there's actually a lot of barriers to doing so. One of the biggest being the boom-bust nature of the housing cycle and the housing market, which makes making investments in factories and creating much more overhead that you have to carry through slower times very, very difficult. And with that, lack of certainty becomes really hard to invest more on the factory side of things. And so we've remained an industry that really relies a lot more on people rather than machines, robots, and that sort of thing.
And as we've talked about, one that's dominated by small players, a lot of firms that have fewer than 20 employees, and of course there's some inefficiency in that. Could there be one of the things that your Canadian Home Builders Association has talked about is the de-risking of the financial side of this? What might that look like? What role could governments play to help to get us to a more efficient sector?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we see in our sector, and as we go through the consultations with the expert panel as well, there are a lot of efficiencies in terms of lack of harmonization, in terms of rules, regulations, especially actually at the municipal level. At the provincial level, there's more and more work to harmonize our provincial codes to be on the national code level, and that will help. But when it comes to interpretations of the building code, when it comes to different bylaws and zoning elements, right down at that municipal level, you can be building in a municipality that's literally right next door to another and have pretty completely different rules. So it makes it very, very difficult to scale. So you want to do that at the municipal level. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done probably at the provincial level to help streamline a lot of things and get municipalities to have, basically everything in common ideally so that, you can build the same type of units, literally sometimes across the street from one another, which you can't right now. So that's one element. And then in terms of de-risking, to the question of how do we get more investment, one of the things that we've recommended is if we can get rid of a lot of these other hurdles that will enable us to scale, there's still the market elements. And so can we create a situation with something potential like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, where instead of having a loan that's based on time, let's say 10 years or something like that for your investments in your company, could be based on unit production instead, so that if things slow down, you're not having to pay your loans back quite the same rate and instead take a longer time. Conversely, if things go really great and you produce more houses faster than you expected, you can pay it off faster and ideally get another loan to keep investing in your business.
Not a lot of time here, but we hear and you and I have talked a lot about labor shortages in the sector. Is that partly why these smaller firms are inefficient? They have to share a small pool of skilled workers and trades to get jobs done.
Well, I'd actually suggest, interestingly, it's kind of the opposite. Because it's small businesses, you share these pools of workers. They're able to move around, and it creates for a more stable environment in the current environment we have. Now, if we can change the way we do things and really scale up, that would create more certainty for everybody. You probably would get some larger companies, but even smaller companies would be able to make use of, say, panelized and modular factories to just build their houses a little bit differently than they do now and make use of those scales and efficiencies and productivity.
So good to have you, Kevin. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me anytime.
Kevin Lee is CEO of the Canadian Home Builders Association. Coming up, for all the talk of urban density and housing, it turns out a lot of us don't want to live like that. That's still ahead. But first, our quest to slim down has created fat profits for Novo Nordisk. That's the maker of super popular Ozempic and Wegovy. In fact, sales of the diet drugs will soon be bigger than the parent company's R&D budget for the past 30 years. That's led some to wonder if the exorbitant price for the wonder drugs should also slim down a little, which has a U.S. list price of about $1,000 a month. The U.S. Senate took the issue up this week, giving this weighty subject the attention it deserves. We're back after this.